Okay, thank you, Jessica.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Like Michael's presentation, mine also focuses on interannual variability of ice cover. Michael laid a really great foundation for the overall Great Lakes, and this was also touched upon in a couple of questions that came up. I will be focusing on Green Bay and Western Lake Erie ice coverage through the same time period, 1973 to 2023. And with that said, this summer I have had the privilege of working under Dr. Jia Wong and Dr. David Cannon, researching with this project. And before I dive in, I would like to thank Jia and David for their guidance and support throughout this project. I'd like to thank Mary, Margaret, and Aubrey for always ensuring a really smooth program and a really fun summer for the interns. And a thank you to all the Sigler and Gloral staff for creating such a welcoming environment for all the fellows this summer. And quick introduction about me. I was born and raised in West Bloomfield, so I'm pretty local my entire life. I came to college having not really a clue what I wanted to do, but I knew I liked science. And so with a lot of exposure to physical geography and modeling, I settled on pursuing my bachelor's of science in environment, where I'm now specializing in environmental informatics. And a quick overview of this presentation, we'll start with an introduction of the motivations to this project, followed by a debrief of our data and methodology. And after presenting our results and analysis, this presentation will conclude with some key takeaways. So, like Michael mentioned, Green Bay and Western Lake Erie are quite shallow, isolated regions with comparison to the rest of the Great Lakes. And this contributes to elevated ice concentrations that we'll see in the winter seasons to come. And Green Bay and Western Lake Erie are very important economic regions for the Great Lakes. And so these are very important regions to fisheries and local marine ecosystems. These regions support a lot of tourism and shipping activity, and ice coverage in these regions is a very important study for these types of situations. So similar to Michael's project, data for this project was obtained with gridded ice data produced from the United States National Ice Center. This was produced through satellite data since 1973. And to specifically subset data for these two regions, we used a gridded land mask from the Great Lakes Coast Watch, lake masks, and shoreline data files. And also like Michael's project, all of these trends were conducted using linear regression analysis in the form of y equals a plus b times t, where a is the y-intercept or the first value of data, b is the slope, and t is the rate of change with respect to time. So moving into the climatologically filled data that was mentioned earlier. This figure on the screen shows the mean daily percentage of ice coverage for Green Bay and Western Lake Erie between the years of 1973 and 2023. The ice cover climatology in Green Bay is represented by the solid line, and the ice cover climatology in Western Lake Erie is represented by the dashed line. Inconsistent seasonal ice reporting, as James touched upon earlier, especially within the early historical record of this study, complicated our analysis. And so this project experimented with specially treating the data through a process called climatology filling during the growth and decay periods. And to illustrate why this climatological filling was necessary, I'd like to direct you your attention to these time series plots, both covering percent ice coverage, Green Bay to the left, Western Lake Erie to the right. The climatologically filled plots are on the top row, and the pre-climatologically filled or unclimatologically filled plots are shown in the second row. So Green Bay's 1997 winter season is depicted in the red, with the red rectangle. And you'll notice the first date of ice coverage collected for the pre-climatologically filled, the ice coverage was already documented at nearly 100% ice coverage. So very clearly, this is not the actual literal first day of ice coverage. It's just the first documented date of ice cover. So we have a significant amount of data missing at the beginning of the ice season. And the same situation occurs during Western Lake. Oh, there we go. The same situation occurs during Western Lake Erie's 1981 season, shown to the right. Many winter seasons for both of these regions are significantly missing data during their growth period. And so to treat this missing data, our project experimented with filling in the missing data and replacing that missing data with the corresponding mean daily ice cover from the previously shown ice cover climatology plot. And the figure at the bottom of the screen shows the number of climatologically days that were filled for each year, also known as the number of days of data that were missing throughout each year. And all subsequent figures in the show will be using this climatologically filled data that was created from these two time series. So moving into results, seasonal variation of ice coverage statistics were calculated based on the Gregorian calendar year, where week 1 is representing the first week of January and week 52 is representing the last week of December. All of these used a 10% ice coverage threshold, similar to what Michael addressed. And this table shows that the average onset of ice cover occurs 1 week earlier in Green Bay than in Western Lake Erie, and the offset week of ice coverage in Green Bay occurs 3 weeks earlier than the average offset in Western Lake Erie. They both achieve maximum approximately the same time, Green Bay being a week earlier than Western Lake Erie. And the two figures at the bottom of the in the bottom plot represent the ice cover climatology of these regions with weekly ice cover variations, denoted using 1 standard deviation above and below the mean percent ice cover climate cover. So the main takeaway from these figures is that ice coverage in Western Lake Erie is more variable and less predictable than in Green Bay. Not to say Green Bay is not variable or not predictable, but Western Lake Erie has a bit more in that respect. As shown earlier, these are climatologically filled time series of ice concentration in these two regions. Both of these regions have very shallow depths, so complete ice coverage is commonly achieved throughout all of these seasons. In Green Bay, all 51 winter seasons achieved at least a 95% ice coverage, but in Western Lake Erie, only 41 of the 51 seasons achieved at least 95% ice coverage. That said, as Michael mentioned, the year 1998 was a very pivotal shift in Great Lakes ice coverage, and this topic will be explored further throughout this presentation. In analyzing the date of first and last ice coverage with climatologically filled data, we found that the average date of first ice cover in Green Bay is in mid-December, and the average date of last ice coverage was in mid-April. Western Lake Erie followed a slightly shorter timeline where the average date of first ice coverage was in mid-December and the average date of last ice coverage was in mid-March. In both these regions, as ice cover is forming later in the calendar year as time progresses, and we found that ice coverage seems to be melting earlier in the calendar year. This occurrence has resulted in a decrease in the overall duration of ice coverage in both Green Bay and Western Lake Erie. During this 51-year period, the number of days of ice coverage in Green Bay decreased by approximately 4.13 days per decade, and the number of days of ice coverage in Western Lake Erie decreased by approximately 9 days per decade. All in all, this resulted in Green Bay losing approximately 21 days of ice coverage throughout the entire 51-year period, and Western Lake Erie lost approximately 46 days of ice coverage. And as mentioned earlier, because 1998 was such a pivotal year for ice coverage, we added an additional interval analysis from 1973 to 1998, and then again from 1998 to 2023. Using this analysis, we found that the rate of decrease for ice cover duration in Green Bay was faster during the years 1973 to 1998. However, in Western Lake Erie, this rate of decrease occurred at a faster rate from 1998 to 2023 in the later interval. In both regions, the rate of change for the duration of ice coverage was more statistically significant in the earlier interval, 1973 to 1998, than in the years 1998 to 2023. With respect to average maximum ice coverage, also known as AMIC, It's important to note that because Green Bay and Western Lake Erie are shallow and isolated, it's, again, very common to attain high maximum ice coverage. And similarly, we also did an analysis from 1973 to 1998, and then again, an analysis for post-1998. This found that AMIC in Green Bay decreased by approximately 0.02% per year during pre-1998 and decreased by approximately 0.01% per year post-1998. In comparison, Western Lake Erie decreased by approximately 0.31% pre-1998, but increased by 0.27% per year post-1998. And we found that for both regions, we found that the rate of change in AMIC was more statistically significant during the pre-1998 years than post-1998. Ultimately, throughout the entire period, AMIC in Green Bay decreased by approximately 1%, and AMIC in Western Lake Erie decreased by about approximately 5%. That said, as Michael discussed, annual average maximum ice cover is more meaningful than AMIC in climate change analysis because it does implicitly include duration. So in Green Bay, we found that the average annual ice coverage, AAIC, decreased by approximately 0.25% per year pre-1998, but only decreased by approximately 0.003% per year post-1998. Western Lake Erie had slightly larger decreases. Pre-1998, that decrease was by a rate of approximately 0.26%, and post-1998, it was approximately 0.19%, resulting in a total loss of 13.5% in annual average ice cover in Western Lake Erie, and approximately 10% loss of AAIC in Green Bay. So with all that said, the overall impact of the climatologically filling showed that this had a much larger impact on smaller spatial scales, such as the two regions I addressed, versus the larger scales of an entire Lake Michigan, like Michael's presentation addressed. This climatological filling revealed figures that supported observed trends in the Great Lakes. However, this method of analysis appeared to overestimate the magnitude of these trends. On that note, climatological filling brought up a few challenges. Shown to the right is again the plot of the number of climatologically filled days per year. It shows that as time progresses, this data set is less likely to be missing data values. So because of this imbalance in missing values, the climatologically filled data is a bit biased toward years containing less missing data. This is an example of the significant impact that climatologically filling data may have. In these plots of the date of first and last ice cover, the date of first ice coverage is shown as a consistent value from 1973 all the way until the 1990s. The date of the first ice coverage in these plots, because using a climatologically filling, was influenced by the mean daily percent ice coverage, which again was influenced primarily by the existing date of ice coverage that was primarily occurring in the post-1990s and onward. So in summary, the amount of missing data significantly complicated our analysis with the climatological filling. Another challenge that this brought up was that the climatological filling does not have room to account for the annual physical forcings that contribute to changing Great Lakes pattern. And so the analysis that I conducted assumed a more stationary climate for the Great Lakes than what actually exists in the observed data. All things considered, I'd like to leave you with a few takeaways from this presentation. First, ice coverage in Western Lake Erie is more variable and therefore less predictable than Green Bay. Again, not to say that Green Bay has highly predictable or highly unvariable ice coverage, just less variable and slightly more predictable than Western Lake Erie. Secondly, the duration of ice coverage, AAIC, and AMIC are all decreasing in both regions, though they decrease at a faster rate in Western Lake Erie than they do in Green Bay. Third, because what average annual ice coverage implicitly includes ice duration, it is a more meaningful analysis for climate change than AMIC. And finally, the climatologically filled method data did support trends, observed trends in the annual ice coverage in the Great Lakes. However, this method, again, showed a tendency to overestimate the magnitude of these trends. And thank you for attending your presentation. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Great job, Jessica. Question.
Very nice talk. It's first just like a clarification question about your point about assuming stationarity. So like if you were to look at a given, like a missing day, some missing day in 1974, and then look at the next year for that same missing day, they would have the same value because they've just been filled in. Is that sort of the issue with the stationary assumption?
So because there's so much missing, because there's so much missing data during the growth period, especially with these early years, it can be specifically filling in the data might not account for the accurate forcings that were there during, I guess, for example, atmospheric patterns, lake temperature, a lot of different factors that might impact ice coverage in the Great Lakes would vary between 1994 and 1993. And so I just wanted to add a caveat that there are a lot of unaccounted for variables throughout this analysis.
Sure, okay, that makes sense. And then you talked about the difference in variability. I think you said that Western Lake Erie was more variable. Anyways, whichever it is.
Yes, yes.
Do you have a hypothesis as to why that might be? Like obviously, like Green Bay is more isolated.
Yes.
But like, do you have an idea?
Yeah. So Western Lake Erie is a lot more shallow than Green Bay, and so it tends to have more ice coverage with the depth and with the smaller area compared to Green Bay. So I think it's just more of a geographic difference.
Anything online, Aubrey? We've got time for one more question.
Yes, great presentation. A lot of statistics. I like to see that. If you wanted to find a way to either visualize, capture, or take account of the non-stationary patterns of, so for example, if you said, okay, I want to fix this. I don't want my early Lake Erie days to be all the same. What would you do? What kind of analysis do you think you would do to try to capture, say, hey, onset days are going to be different?
Yeah, so one of the potential solutions we've discussed is taking, instead of just inputting the data with an average of everything, taking potentially the first week of ice coverage, so potentially the first week ice coverage of the 1975 season, and extending that through the data, and to try to make it more fluid in terms of what was going on at that specific time. That I'm not sure how well that answers your question. But.
So you mean like kind of connecting, okay, we have the early data from 1975, and then we have the early data from 2000, and so like kind of connecting those two.
Being able, I do have a pointer. If you can see how each season in the top, it's a lot more of a fluid flow. Everything is interconnected, whereas there's a lot of gaps in primarily the beginning of the season. So potentially taking the first week of this ice season and being able to extend it and find a connection between that and the previous, as opposed to the method we use, which was taking the overall climatology for the entirety of the period and inputting those data.
Thank you.